Hello and welcome to part 3 of 3 of our program design videos for Training Made Fun. Once again, I'm Mark Baines with Training Made Fun as the Executive Director, and I'm also a professor at Concordia University in kinesiology. We talked in the previous 2 videos about the 3 general concepts or areas of fitness in health-related, skill-related, and then physiological specific variables for fitness. That said, we talked about the general breakdown of a given training session, how it should generally look in a given training session, and the specific variables you have in each individual training session that you're looking at changing or adapting on a given day and over time in terms of frequency for the intensity, time under tension, type, rate, or I should say rest or recovery, and rate of progression. And we talked about said specific adaptation to impose demands and specificity. And now we're going to kind of tie all these concepts kind of together and getting a better idea about how to design a very effective, safe, and efficient training program. Please never forget those 3 basic words. They're very vital: safe, efficient, and effective. If you can't think of something, if you can't think of anything more safe and or more efficient and or more effective, preferably all 3, then you're picking the right exercise right now. If you can pick something else that might fit in those categories better, especially in the more efficiency and more effectiveness, let alone the more safety, then that's the exercise you should be picking, not the one you're currently doing, if that's an option. We have to always be evaluating if there are better ways than what we're doing right now to achieve a specific goal on any given day. There's no such thing as this is the best for everyone. We should always do this exercise for people. Well, there's always variations in those things. There's some general good ideas. Some things certainly are the most likely to be the case, that walking is where everyone should start doing their cardiovascular training and where they should be doing the majority of their cardiovascular training, unless they're a elite cyclist or elite swimmer or elite rower or some other athlete that requires more time not just spent on land doing basic walking and running and whatnot. Otherwise, we're trying to progress someone from walking into jogging into running, if at all possible to do so. That's very general because it's not always true for everyone. That said, if the order of training were to occur whereby you're training multiple variables on a given day, it would be a little crazy, honestly, for a given training session for any individual. If we're doing one-on-one sessions, probably not going to train all 5 of these primary factors: agility and basic overall coordination, power, speed, strength, and cardiovascular work, all in the same day. That's a lot of stuff with a lot of conflicting benefits and needs on a given day. Probably more likely to be different days, and some of that work might not even occur at all for some people. In a given group training session, it would not be unusual to see a combination of all 5 of those factors, in which case, generally speaking, if we did do all 5 or a combination thereof, generally speaking, if you're going to do agility work, that should probably come right after your warm-up. Because it's the most technique intensive and it's very speed oriented. It's requiring significant levels of force, a lot of change of direction, requiring a high level of coordination and ability. So generally speaking, if that's going to be part of your training program on a given day, it's highly recommended that be the first thing you do following your warm-up. And that said, if you have power work, well, it would either be the first thing you do or it's going to follow your agility work. And the power work, again, we're talking about explosive force output. We're talking about producing high levels of force with probably very low loads at very high rates of speed. Because if you're trying to be more powerful, you're trying to perform high levels of force production over greater distances in less time. If you're trying to do it in less time, you can't have high loads. And that's something we have to really, really take into account with power type work. And then speed type work would be something you would do next or first if you're not doing power and agility work. And your speed work, again, we're talking about linear work, whereby you're trying to get from point A to point B very quick, trying to be over 5-10 yard distance for the very beginning and increasing that over time to longer and longer distances depending upon the goal and the need of the person we're training. Okay, strength work would then be the next thing you do in a given training session if it were following any of these other goals of speed, power, or agility type work. Strength work would be next. We're still requiring high levels of force production, but not nearly as high coordination requirement, and certainly not high rate of movement requirement that the other exercises have. So consequently, strength work is recommended to be 4th in this grouping of variable types of exercise. And then cardiovascular work would theoretically be your last. Now, keeping in mind, as we said before, in a group setting, that would make perfect sense to go in that rough order. But in a situation whereby you're working with specific athletes who a specific need is toward cardiovascular conditioning, that probably is going to be the first thing you do. Or if their specific need is speed work, you're going to put the agility work on the back burner and do the speed work first. So there's always that possibility, but just take into account that if you go against this general guideline for what you would do in a given training session, as far as order of types of exercise or specific focus points, we should say, for exercise, that you are going to be potentially creating some challenges here in terms of technique or force production or rate of force production. And those are things we don't want to challenge too much because it's going to create the probability of moving poorly. So if form breaks down, force production is going to be lesser. If force production is lesser and the stress is still high with poor movement skill, we're increasing the probability of injury and decreasing the probability of getting the benefit we're looking for from the exercise. So that needs to be kept in mind at all times when we design these things, these variables into our program. Okay, most technique intensive or most demanding exercises first, followed by those that are less demanding or less specifically needed or required for the athlete or individual we're working with. Okay, and that said, in terms of your designing of programs, you must always continue to go back over the exercise sciences, which means overall study of kinesiology, which then relates in subsets to biomechanics, anatomy, and physiology, going back to textbooks. If you don't have textbooks, you better have them in your library at home or have access to them and be going back to them regularly, because no matter how smart you are, how capable you are, how experienced you are, or intuitive you are, you need to have the background of the science to support what you do before you ever give it to someone else who has a different level of need or interest beyond what you feel is important to you. What works for you is called anecdotal. It doesn't necessarily work for any other individual. What works for one individual does not necessarily work for another. So we have to use our guidelines of research science, then we add in the additional variables that relate to the individual. And that comes through for starting with after having the background of the science and everyday reading. When we talked about it in previous videos, we talked about you beginning your levels of training, talking about every day, an hour of study each day. If you don't do it, that's okay, but that's also less likely to be you're more likely to be challenges for you down the road with training because you don't have the background or you can't recall some of the same information you learned in the past. And no one recalls everything they learned unless they continue to go back over and learn it again and again and again. Mastery is mastering the basics. Mastering the basics only comes from continual review of the basics. And that said, assessments should be at least every 12 weeks, if not at least every 4 weeks. General recommendations every 4 to 8 weeks because of nervous system and endocrine system changes that occur over a given 4 to 8 week period. Thus, we should see, if nothing else, improvements in movement skill, in coordination, in basic recognition of how to respond and adjust rate of speed, and some adjustments in rate of force production, maybe some changes in muscular size and hypertrophy. Hypertrophy, some research would say, begins to show itself as detectable after about 3 to 4 weeks. Detectable is not significant. We don't see significant changes from hypertrophy until about 6 weeks or longer with exercise, okay? Not somewhere where it's significant, okay? Give or take. That said, then we start looking at our acute program variables of type of exercise, what order we're going to go in. Generally speaking, we say more simple to complex, going towards single joint actions before you start engaging complex joint actions. I'd have someone doing a pec deck fly or a simple fly type motion, which is just shoulder horizontal adduction, long before I'd have someone doing shoulder adduction with elbow extension, which is a press. Because the shoulder adduction, horizontal adduction with the elbow extension is a chest press, if you will, or a push-up or dumbbell chest press, machine chest press, but you're also incorporating more joints. By incorporating more joints, you're making it more complex. By making it more complex, if the person does not have high levels of movement skill, you're actually going to decrease benefit from the exercise. So be clear about that. And also order of exercise, we talk about basically stable to unstable. Make sure the person can handle stable before they start getting unstable. Be very careful about unstable surface training or unstable loads, one arm versus another, if the person doesn't have the basic capacity to move well as a general rule. Okay, there's always variables within that guideline, but generally speaking, that's true. Certainly slow before fast, that's should be a given. If you can't do it slow, don't ask someone to do it fast. They can't make it look pretty, just the motion itself, not talking about being loaded. They can't make the general motion that's going to be required in a given exercise. They can't perform that motion slowly, efficiently, effectively. Then they have no business going fast or adding significant load. It's just that simple. Okay, and remember, of course, the basic 3 rules. If someone does not move well, you reduce the speed, number 1, possibly reduce the range of motion, and if possible to do so, reduce the load. If those 3 things don't work, you have the wrong exercise at this moment in time. Okay, number of sets per exercise. We often talk about having less sets per exercise, more exercises in the early phases of training in a given training year. And as you progress through more challenging phases, as you progress through different levels, you'll start to see lesser number of exercises, but more sets per exercise. As a general rule of thumb, a typical range of somewhere between 3 to 6 sets is probably enough for most human beings in most situations as you get more and more challenging. There are very few situations where someone needs to have 8 to 10 or more sets of a given exercise outside of a specific performance level for someone's requiring for some elite level of performance. Okay, even then can be questionable at times. That said, number of repetitions per set, we're not going to count reps. We don't want you to count reps. We want you to go for time, to be conscious of time as it relates to energy systems, as that then relates to specific goals and muscle fiber types. Okay, and we want to be clear about then knowing approximately what they should be able to do during that time period should give you the proper number of reps rather than counting reps, because if you go and engage a given number of repetitions and yet you have the wrong speed or poor movement patterns, you're not going to get the adaptation or benefit you're looking for. You're much better off focused on the proper time with a load you can handle during that time based upon your understanding of the specific goal, the specific energy system, and the specific muscle fiber type that's involved predominantly in this particular movement or joint action. And then you're going to get the best benefit, not counting reps. Okay? Rest periods between sets generally start fairly short between sets and get longer as you get more and more intense over a period of time. However, for brand new people, new to training, allow longer rest periods because they're going to have a hard time transitioning from one exercise to the next, and that's okay. Let them adjust. Okay? Speed of movement, of course, as we mentioned, start slow and move faster over time, or start slow with lower loads for longer durations, then start decreasing their work periods over time, increasing the rest periods as you increase the load and or the speed of motion. But again, do not expect high speed with higher loads. If the goal is speed, then lower the load. If the goal is strength, you're going to have no choice but to lower the speed because the load's going to be so significant you can't move fast. And more importantly, if whatever you do, whether it's speed or force specifically focused towards strength or towards speed, both of which are close, but they're not the same thing. They're both revolving around the concept of force. One is more about getting more force production as a whole. One is more about producing whatever force you've got in a short amount of time, right? Regardless, if movement skill goes down, decreases, you don't see proper movement patterns, or you see facial expressions change dramatically, I don't care what you think you see or what's going on, performance is waning, and consequently you need to allow for a break right now to allow the person to come back. We're not talking about in the middle of a high-intense competition. That's competition. It's a different story in the competition itself, but regardless whether you're training the general population or an athlete, in practice, in your training sessions, if they start to see the facial expression change dramatically, or you start to see a breakdown in form, that's the time to stop. You don't train through that unless you're okay with training bad form and thus lower performance. If you just basically are saying, I'm okay with training a lesser performance, be clear that's what your goal is because that's what you're doing. Okay. Of course, we want to make sure we individualize the program as much as can be done. What's good for some is not good for others. Just because you've got 12 basketball players or you've got 40, 50, 60, 70 football players, they should not all be doing the same exact drills. It's very specific to individual positions because of different coordination and skill demands for given positions, size demands, speed demands, force demands, movement demands. There's so many variations there. Track athletes, they may all be running. Maybe they're all running the same distance. Maybe they're all running a 400 or 800 or 200 or 2 mile, whatever it is. However, some athletes are going to be benefited more by doing more towards the strength or the strength endurance. Some will be more focused on the cardiovascular fitness need. Some will be having greater need towards anaerobic power and speed and glycolytic development. Take it individually. Don't just make it blanket for everyone you train exactly the same way. That's a great recipe for mediocre response from most people. Okay, and possibly some great success from a few people and probably some great failure from a few people. To get the most, you have to make adjustments based upon needs on top of your general program idea that you have going into it. Macro assessments are the ones we perform every 4 to 12 weeks, as we said. 4 to 8 ideally, not more than 12. The reason why not more than 12 is we're going to miss opportunities to adapt and change our current program, adapting the frequency, adapting the intensity, adapting the type of tool we're using for the exercise, adapting the time under tension, adapting the rest periods between, adapting however we're progressing, the rate of progression, right? Fitter variables. If we go too long, we may be missing something that we're not getting any benefit from. We continue to do the same things, right? And it's also, I love doing assessments more often when you start seeing dramatic changes in the program. You need to do an assessment to make sure you're getting benefit from what you do. And you can't just assess that one thing you want to train. You have to assess the broader perspective of all the performance needs the person needs to make sure whatever those variables might be, body composition, speed, power, strength, endurance, or cardiovascular fitness, or motor skill, or a specific motor skill, a specific ability to move a certain way, flexibility, mobility, stability. There's so many variables, right? We're going to make sure you assess enough things to know that although you might be seeing a gain in one area, you're going to see a decrease in something else. And that has to be okay with both you and the person you're training for that to be a reasonable determination to be utilizing whatever exercises or manner of which you're implementing those exercises to make sure both parties agree, okay? Long-term planning is periodization, the gradual cycling of program variables to achieve a specific goal or need. We've got to make sure generally speaking, every 4 to 12 weeks, hence that's why we assess in that time frame too. We're going to make some moderate adjustments in our programming to those variables of frequency, intensity, time under tension, type, rest or rate of recovery, and rate of progression. Okay, that's the big picture. Treat people as individuals. We have some very important guidelines that most people fall within. However, there's always a variable on a given day that it makes you adjust something to some extent, or adjustment for a given person based upon individual special needs for various reasons. Okay. And so here we have the basic variables kind of broken down here. Type of exercise, which we've talked about. What's the tool you're going to use? Order of exercise. No specific magic to this. But we talked about the 5 variables of agility, speed, power, strength, and cardiovascular fitness for adjusting them based upon expectation of the overall program, as well as what you're doing in a given day. We talk about larger muscles before smaller muscles. Generally speaking, don't really like that particular way of looking at things because you can look at joint actions. The joints, the bones, as we talk about in the biomechanics videos, are far more important than looking at the muscle. Because if the joint can't do its job properly, the muscle's not going to be able to be benefited anyway, or it's going to create so much stress to the joint, it'll affect the muscle negatively. We're going to look at muscles from a standpoint of visually. No one talks about, hey, I like those joints, nice shoulder, nice elbow, I like that knee. No one's going to say stuff like that. People are going to talk about how they like your quads, they like your triceps, they like your pecs, they think nice abs, whatever. So everyone's worried about the visual component of it, the aesthetic component, which is understandable. We're human beings, we're social animals, and of course we are aware of these things, we see it in each other, we want these things, it's totally fair. But when you train, you must first train the joint before you start worrying about what the muscle does, or you're not going to get the proper benefit, and you're going to increase the probability of injury. Volume of exercise, we start generally speaking with a high number of sets, high number of exercises. However, the total volume is not so much intense in terms of load, external load. The external load, which is an aspect of volume as well, is going to go up. The amount of force production we're requiring from our athletes is going to certainly go up over time, but then again, so is the number of exercises, and the number of sets per exercise are going to get more as the work periods get shorter and rest periods get longer. That's a good general rule. Okay. Speed of movement starts slow and can potentially go more towards fast. Generally speaking, a good rule of thumb for tempo is a couple seconds in one direction when you're loading someone externally, a couple seconds one direction, a couple seconds back. It's a good way to start to make sure someone's moving properly. Okay. And then, of course, you can adjust that based upon need and what you're trying to accomplish. Intensity, as we mentioned, the things you must be measuring with intensity are heart rate and RPE. You can certainly use weight as a measurement of intensity. Time certainly is a measurement of intensity, generally speaking. Time under tension is a better way of looking at it in terms of counting reps, of course. And the primary things you should always be utilizing in every set you ever engage is asking the person after every set finishes, on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard was that? After you've been training someone for a number of days or weeks or months, you don't even have to ask. The set will be done. They'll perform bodyweight squats or go on a run or lifting a heavy load or whatever. They'll stop and they'll go, it's probably about level 6. I felt that was about level 6. And they'll put their hand on the radial artery and they'll they'll tell you, let me know when to start, and you'll say go, and you'll count for 6 seconds and say stop, and they won't count the first beat, and they'll go, that was about a 7, or that was a 7, that's what I got. All right, 7 times 10 if they did for 6 seconds, because we're trying to get a recognition of 60-second increment for beats per minute. That would give you a 70 heart rate. You write that down. Every time you write that down, what you should see over time is that the same performance, heart rate should be dropping, okay? And over time, with lesser heart rates, be able to do more and more work, either going faster or producing more force or having more or going for longer duration, any number of factors, maybe all of the above. That's what should be happening over time. And you can't just say, got out a 10th rep. No, if we go for time versus reps, that'll eliminate that because they don't have a good rep. We don't count it. You were supposed to go for 45 seconds. We went for 38 seconds, and we write that down. The more technically precise you can be, the more information you can track, the more we know how to adapt the program based upon someone's goals and what's happening in front of us. Okay? And of course, rest periods, as we mentioned, start shorter and go longer over time as the intensity picks up. Okay? And look at energy systems and the videos there to understand how we should be adjusting those rest periods. And finally then, looking at the overall breakdown on a given day for a given training session, when we're trying to design a program, first of all, we have to understand who we're training and what their specific capabilities are, what can they do, and what are they limited by? What can they not do to make sure we don't get anything near this limitation, this negative thing? Unfortunately, it happens all the time. We give everybody a dumbbell and say, press it over your head without knowing what their range of motion capability is. Do they have the spinal stability for it? Can they mobilize their spine, thoracic spine, into proper extension to be able to get proper upright spinal position before pressing a load over their head? Or do we understand their range of motion capabilities for their shoulder? Are they going to go down? Are they going down too low? They draw the shoulder out of its proper position when they do it. There's a lot of variables we need to be looking at before you give someone a load or ask them to do an exercise. And we look at our energy systems, understanding of kinesiology, look at biomechanics, understanding of physiology before we get to this point, okay? If you want to maximize the benefits from what we get with this. And if you haven't already figured this out, we've said it in previous videos before, we're going to say it again, you can do stuff. You can give someone a bunch of weight. Make it a challenging exercise. This is tough. Try this. And you might get lucky. It's like throwing a rock. Sometimes that rock hits exactly where it's supposed to go, okay? But you're throwing a rock when what you need is a screwdriver, or what you need more specifically is a variable set of tools. You can't just take a rock and throw it at stuff all the time. Sometimes that'll work. If the goal is to break the window, throw a big enough rock and throw it hard enough, it'll work, okay? But if it's something more than not trying to break things, not trying to just use blunt force all the time to force the issue with things, sometimes you need some different tools, different perspectives, different ways of doing things. So don't be so single-minded with the way that we train. Or, here's a big one, doing what we've done in the past because we feel like if I change right now based on something I'm seeing or hearing now, it's wrong because that's not the way I was taught. You know, whoever has taught you before this, including us talking to you now, you're taking the sum total of everything you know and making better decisions, because at the end of the day, you're making your own decisions. Don't worry about how much you're going to be hurting someone else for what they said. You got to make sure it's making the best determination or the best decision for you and the person you're training. It's that simple, okay? Is it really the best? And that's all you've got in this moment, based on what you know and applying it to the best of your ability. Discover their goals. Don't just assume that what they said 6 weeks ago or 6 months ago or a year ago is still the same. Are your goals the same? Have they changed? Because most people's goals change at least somewhat over the course of a month or two, maybe even a few months. Maybe it's more often than that, all depending on someone's just getting into a program, never been in one before. 2 weeks into it, their goals might change. So ask them. So are your goals still the same of wanting to lose about 20 pounds and seeing maybe a dress size or two go down? Or your primary goal is to be able to do 20 push-ups, or your primary goal is to be able to run a mile in under 8 minutes? Whatever the goal is, be as specific as possible, make it as training specific as possible. Prefer to get away from the body fat, body weight kind of concept goals as the only goal. It's okay if it's a goal, but you need to have a training or physiological performance type goal, or basically it's real simple. People who don't have any physiological or performance related goal, 90% of them never get their goals, or if they ever get to their goals of the weight loss, the body fat, whatnot, they fall back and they fall off and they don't get it again. They go away from it, really far away from it, and they get frustrated because they're focused on the aesthetic goal. They didn't understand the need for proper performance goals. Get the proper performance goals and meet those performance goals over time. What should happen as a consequence is you seeing reductions in body fat, you seeing more muscle, you're seeing that leaning out, if you will, all those things that most people are wanting when it comes to general weight loss or overall aesthetic look. Okay. That said, explicit is what they tell you. Implicit is what you're gathering from what they're not telling you, but their body language and the way they're doing things. Never hesitate to ask the question, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Those questions, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Are your goals the same? Is your goal different today than it normally is? Do you have a different goal for today? Would you like to do something different? Why? Be clear about that before you make the determination to do it. Decide their training age. This is a general concept of what they've been doing, not just as a course of their career with fitness and exercise and performance or athletic performance, but what have they done lately? If you've not trained in the last 3 months, it's like you got to start over. Not talking about starting over like you're going to be like you were back when you were 6 years old maybe, but certainly starting over from the base level 1 of training programming, focusing on primarily coordination, movement skill development, avoiding getting more flexibility, very basic low-level strength endurance type work, and moving better as a whole before you start worrying about more challenging activity. Choose the level or stage that's most appropriate to you. When we talk about general programming, most programs that talk about training program design have between 3 and as many as 7 levels to put people through. Okay, and regardless whether it's 3 or 7, we have to understand those general progressions we've already talked about, but we have to take into account where we want them to be, where they feel they are, and what they're really capable of doing, as well as looking at it from a year perspective before we start making some changes from there. Don't just do the same things year in, year out. That doesn't make any sense, because people should be changing, theoretically, if they're certainly training the way we want them to be training. Okay? And of course, that experience with you plays a big role in what you see each day and how much you record. Warming up exercises, rather than just doing a bunch of warm-up random stuff, probably generally speaking, look at 3, as many as 7 different movements that you think are the most applicable to benefiting them from whatever's going to come next in the training session. Should take anywhere between 5 to 15 minutes-ish, as we said. Okay? Your exercise selection in a given training session, what we're doing, assuming we're not talking about just pure cardio, where you're just running or just swimming or cycling or whatnot. We're talking about something more to the weight room or some group exercise class or a boot camp or however you want to think about this, or a given practice with sport. We're talking about overall exercise and overall strengthening, the strength endurance benefit, all those things, hypertrophy, maximal strength power. Anywhere as little as 4 exercises up to about 15 plus. When are you doing 15 plus? In the early phases when you're only doing 1 set per exercise, just trying to get more movement skill, more basic endurance. As you increase your ability to perform and you move more towards power and maximal speed and agility, and I don't care who you are, if you're 8, 18, 80, however old you are, we want to see people try to do the best we can, progressing to the different levels to maximize the benefit that they can get, knowing full well there's going to be limitations they have. And we got to tell them that, going, hey, I know you're 50 years old. We're not expecting to be a professional athlete. If you want to be, we'll do what we can with that. If that's not your goal, we're not trying to be maximally powerful and be able to run a sub-10 second 100-meter dash like Usain Bolt. We're not trying to be able to lift hundreds of pounds over your head, okay, like an Olympic lifter would be doing for Olympic lifting. We're talking about just maximizing your specific individual power, okay? And of course, cooling down. 10 to 15 minutes is pretty normal, as little as 5 minutes in some situations. Again, trying to turn the body towards homeostasis. You could use the same exact movement you used in your warm-up for your cool down. That's not unheard of. That's not a bad idea at all. It doesn't have to be that, but the whole idea is to get you ready for the rest of your day, the next 23 hours or 22 hours or whatever it is, not to get you just doing a bunch of stuff to, quote, cool down. Return to homeostasis, get the heart rate back down, get the body moving all the areas you're moving during the training session, moving at lower intensities, trying to go from whatever intensity you're at during the training session, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100% maximal force output, trying to bring it back down to closer to 40, 30, 20% force output. So it's kind of an easy transition back down into the normal rest of the day. The better you can do that, more efficiently you can do that, the more they're going to get performance gains in a very fast period of time, be able to come back the next day or soon thereafter and train at a higher level again soon. The more we can get them recovery shortened to the benefit of being able to perform better, the better off we're getting, the more we're doing an effective job with our programming. The goal is not to beat you up. If you're stiff, if you're sore, if you're feeling worn down the next day, we got to do a better job of probably warming up and cooling down and probably adjusting some training variables to make sure that's not the case. You're not supposed to beat up the next day. You might not be able to produce the same level of force you did the day before, but being generally fatigued or peripheral fatigued, whereby, God, I can't do much at all with my arms, like you've lost tremendous force production, and that's too intense. It's just too intense. Or the cool down was not done properly, or you can even go farther than that, really, right? Maybe your nutrition's not there, your sleep's not there, life stress is high. You've got to look at it all, of course, when you have the ability to do that. Apply ST as strength training, fitter variables, again, frequency, intensity, time under tension, type or tool, rate recovery or rest, and rate of progression. Apply these principles to steps 5, 6, and 7 so we understand how often we should do it, what intensity, what tool we're going to use, what time under tension we're going to use, what's the rest we're going to use. And that's really designing a program. And record that data every day and review that session data prior to doing the one after, so you know kind of not just what you want to do as a general rule, but what happened last time, making notes to yourself in the margins everywhere so you have good data to work with to design a better training program next time. You could be a person who has very little experience in this field, but you could be taking the time to follow these steps very closely and doing a far better job at designing programs than someone who's a veteran of doing it for 20 years, who has not taken the time to go back over the sciences, go back over and assess, to write down all the data, to try to plan the best of their ability based on what they're seeing, using these specific concepts. They're not going to design as good a training program as you will if you're a beginner. And if you're a veteran and you need to apply these programming variables, then we get whole new levels of benefit to the people we're trying to help. And you'll start hearing things like, I've trained with a lot of people, or I've had a lot of coaches. I've never had results like this before. I've never felt so good, never felt so strong, never felt so beneficial from what we're doing. I don't feel worn down anymore. The kind of stuff that people talk about that's life-changing. We have the capacity to do this, but we must take the time to design safer, more efficient, more effective programs by utilizing the science and the variables we have to be able to design those programs and not just throw stuff at people. We're better than that. We want more of our people, from our people, with that. So, pleasant training, do well, let us know how we can help, and on to the next unit.